Hello, welcome to the new podcast series, King of the Middle, with Michael Joel Green and Chris Moore. Here's Michael Green.
Welcome back to King of the Middle podcast. This is a podcast, artists trying to honor God through their creativity. I'm Michael and this is Chris. We thank you for joining in. Last week we were talking about characters, creating memorable characters. And tonight I think we're going to be talking about villains, which has me super excited because I love a good villain. And I love it. As a writer, I adore trying to create a great villain. Chris, I was actually thinking about this ever since I was a kid. I was thinking about this today, actually. Remember, I always rooted for the villains in TV or whatever. So I was even thinking about it. There was the old Batman TV show, which we both grew up on. I usually rooted for the villains in that. And even though I knew what the outcome was going to be, I still rooted for the villains. Superman, I rooted for Lex Luthor. Like Tom and Jerry, I rooted for whichever one the cat was. Or
Tom?
Roadrunner Coyote. I think Thomas Cat. Roadrunner Coyote. Always wanted that coyote to win. So I never really thought about it, but then you kind of ask yourself, am I like the world's worst person of all time? Am I completely immoral? Superman, I think, is the most glaring example. Superman, I think a lot of people root against Superman. And I have an idea on that, and I think a lot of people have the same idea. We can get into that, but even talking about what makes a good villain, I couldn't help but wonder with my own self, it's like, why do I root for the villain so often? So no, it's a question that I thought we could definitely explore.
And I would offer one of the reasons I think we want to explore this, since we're King of the Middle, and we're talking about this, is because we're always looking for a way to make our art, and since you and I are storytellers, how to make our stories really engaging and grab people. And there's no better way than villains and heroes and extreme circumstances, and really bad and really good. And we're all drawn to that. We're drawn to the heroes. But it's interesting that we live in a modern age where we're more drawn to the bad guy now, or the colorful bad guy. The bad guy is like, he's got problems, but he's what's Despicable Me and things like that, where we're a bad guy, but you're got a heart of gold, or you have a heart, your heart's covered in coal, but inside there's a heart that beats gold, or whatever. It's like, it's quite interesting. So what are your thoughts on what are your thoughts about villains? What's the first thing that comes to your mind that you want to talk about tonight?
One, I think a well-drawn villain is, we all can distinguish between sort of the stock villain that you get that has no layers to the person. It's just super bad. But what I'm talking about is that villain that has the layers to the villain. There's depth there, and you want to know, like, what has this person been through? So I think it's definitely part of it. There's also a deeper thing going on here. I do believe that we all have that kind of a shadow side, that we have that dark side. And we'll take Superman. Superman has no flaws. He's so perfect. Nothing beats him. To me, there's no fun in that. And he was also not flawed. I know that I am flawed, deeply, deeply flawed. So I think a good villain allows us to maybe witness that dark side that we let's go back to Romans 1 in the Bible. God says, though we know God, we suppress the truth, the conscience, the Holy Spirit's conscience. So when most of us, now whether it's why do we live by morality, period, that's a good question to get into, but when we are living by a set of moral rules, and then we see that does take some suppressing at times. I want to lie to avoid getting in trouble. But I also see that lying is wrong. So I may not lie because I don't want to suppress that truth that lying is wrong. So then when we see a villain come along in a movie, comic book, and that person completely suppresses the truth of moral law, there's something about it that is fascinating. This person has gone to the extreme of where that conscience has been seared, and they have just gone fully over to the dark side.
What's very interesting while you were talking, I was thinking was, when we're dealing with bad guys, there's the part of us that good can be, quite frankly, boring times, like you were talking about Superman. And we also find ourselves, our natural state of our spirit is to go towards the more fun or the dark or the easier or the less moral route, because it's harder to do right. And it's more fun to be the bad guy. It's more fun to do things wrong in many ways. Now, in the long run, sure, guilt. But in the immediate, boy, it's easier. It can be fun. Not having to worry so much about our moral predicament when we're drawn to the bad guy, when we're the bad guy. So it's interesting that we're always going to be in that battle. The reason that we like the good, I think the good guy and the villains we are at parts of our lives, we find ourselves the villain, and we can't escape it because we're in a fallen, busted up, broken world. So I guess we kind of, and there's fun, like you said, there's fun in it because what is, the old saying, go to heaven for the weather and hell for the company. It's like we have this view that the bad guys are the ones having fun. So there's a part of us that's drawn to say, what kind of mischief are you getting into? And sometimes the bad guys are there to actually, in stories, for instance, are there to actually get us to get on their side, so that then the storyteller can say, yeah, you were on board, but then they do this thing. It's quite interesting to see how you can use a bad guy to like open that door and say, yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then slowly twist it to say, where does in a biblical godly version of reality that we live in, there's a point where that bad is going to turn and become something really bad. And we really like that curve until it just twists a little too extreme. And so what are your thoughts? You mentioned Superman. So let's elaborate, because this Superman is of much controversy, I think, over the years, because a lot of people don't like Superman. I'm quite often bored. I don't get too excited about new Superman movies generally. Why do you think that is? What's your analysis?
For me, it was just that. It was too perfect. Batman had to work for it, and I related to that more. So, and I also think, we'll take Lex Luthor, for example. That's a great character. Using his mind and intelligence to try to foil a superhero perfect person. That's pretty awesome. Maybe not the best looking guy. Gene Hackman are not the best looking guy in the room. But he used what he had to try to... No, I'm not excusing that, of course. But it was a great villain. And when you've got a superhero that is... you don't really relate to... I rooted for him, Lex Luthor, every day. But you know what? I think that one thing that you were talking about that made me think about this. You mentioned we think good equates to boring sometimes. That's very true. Think about when I know as a kid I thought this, and I still have struggled with this at times. We think about like heaven as kind of sitting around with harps playing and doing nothing but singing songs all day, and we think, oh my gosh, that's the most boring thing I've ever heard. And so you get kind of people that joke around saying, I'll choose, the other. When in reality, if we think about heaven, it's the absence of brokenness and sin. Like I want that. And the new creation is going to be beyond anything we can even imagine. So I think we tend to have that skewed vision of good in heaven equals boring. So I think you can even look at that. Like Superman he's boring in a way. He doesn't have to struggle unless kryptonite comes to him. Other than that, he's sort of milk toast for me. He doesn't have much of an edge.
Man, you just hit it. So what I was thinking, and herein lies, I think we just landed on exactly how this plays into what we're about, King of the Middle. If we want to break out of the middle and be in our craft and our art and be better and more amazing at what we do, we have to look at life in a realistic perspective while we're here under heaven. And the problem with Superman is what you just said. If he's the hero who's always doing right, and even in the Zack Snyder stuff, Superman's still generally pretty nice guy, pretty right. Yeah, some people got killed in Man of Steel, and that's a big deal that comes up in the later movies. That what about the bystanders when buildings were collapsing and they got killed? At least there's honesty in that in the Zack Snyder versions, dealing with some real aftermath of being a hero and trying to do right, but you can't always, you're not God. People equate Superman to a Jesus figure, but he's not. And at least Zack Snyder kind of got that. But what's interesting, why we're so bothered by Superman is, and the more old-fashioned view definitely is, because we can't relate to all good and then the bad guys all bad. If the more we see stories where the bad guys have good in them and the good guys are flawed, the more we start to see life and humanity. And for a lot of time, Superman never had that. It's only more modern when we're breaking down our myths. We live in the age now, especially the 21st century, of myth busting. But the fact is, he's been so boring because we don't relate, because we know that bad is very rarely, sometimes you have Hitler and there's bad is pure bad, but there are times where most of the time good is not pure good. And we live in that place, and we look at villains and sometimes certainly the more traditional stories, we empathize maybe because we know that we're messed up. And for how does it relate to being king of the middle? Well, if we're not aware of this as storytellers, and we're not aware when we're writing characters as Christians that the good characters, unless you're talking about Jesus, unless you have God coming down and walking around, if you don't have real flaws and brokenness in those characters, and in the bad characters there isn't humanity, you're just going to write nonsense, and you will be middling in your work. Songs, graphic novelists, whatever the heck you are, painter, whatever. If you're not acknowledging the truth of this fallen world and how we're in a struggle, and we know it biblically, we're in a struggle. If you don't have stories and art that acknowledges that, it feels flat. And that's the problem with a lot of Superman, is it didn't acknowledge that until more recent, I'd say closer to the 21st century, and now in the 21st century. Yeah. So
yeah, that's great. You have your main character, your hero. If you make that person, you have to have that. Your hero has to also be a human, which means he or she has sin and brokenness. And your villain also has to be human, though sinful, also made in the image of God, and so carries that imago Dei, image of God. Then your hero and your villain are both complex and representative of humanity in a way.
And I think that's important. Again, we're trying to encourage all of us, ourselves and others, listeners, viewers. How do we break out of that mold of middling And that's the key, is when you're writing whatever, but in particular, you're going to have good and bad characters, or a good and bad character in most of your stories. You're going to have adversity. And if it's not honest, same thing. If, say, I was writing a story about man versus nature and it was a hurricane coming, if that hurricane did every predictable, terrible thing possible, twisters were spawned, and the twisters hit the local hospital, and the twister hit the sheriff's department, and it hit the electric department and the water department. It hit all these generic, cliched things. And then you were like the hero trying to go against and stop all this. The audience immediately says, something's not right here. The bad, even nature itself, did all the worst possible things with the odds we know are very unlikely, unless it's everything. The whole town gets wiped away, of course, all those places. But if you're not careful and you're literally not using skill and observing life when you're telling a story or writing a song or whatever, and you can use it as an agenda piece, and that just defeats the purpose. And I think what we're finding is, I think we're learning a little something here, maybe, as we're talking about why we don't like old-fashioned Superman. It's too on the nose. The character was too on the nose. And you can do that with villains too. You can have villains that are just pure bad, and some are in real life. Like Hitler, there may be a couple things people who were really close to him thought he was a good guy that were brainwashed, but for the most part, looking at it from a distance, there's pretty much no way you can make that argument about him. But that's rare in life, where there's absolutely very little humanity, and certainly in fiction, we can't. It's dangerous if we use super evil characters that are made up. It's dangerous because most audiences will go, that's not realistic. I need to see good and bad that reflect me. I think that's why we like bad characters. And we're in an age where we've moved from all these characters that were all goody-goody. You and I were raised, we were raised on the Super Friends, and they're all pure good in the cartoons, versus the bad version of all the enemies and, Bizarro, the evil Superman and all.
Really, they're really rotten.
And it's like, that doesn't hold up now. And even at that time, moving into the end of the 20th century, we're like, this doesn't reflect the real world. And there's a certain point where we were ready to move on to start seeing, even in heroes and whatnot, and villains, like, we need to see reality. The scariest villains are always the ones who are the most honest and human. What's one of the best villains that you've ever seen, since you're a big fan?
I was going to ask you that, actually.
Yeah, you said
that was
Lex
my next question
Luthor.
for you.
I know there are a bunch, but I'm suddenly forgetting. There's some great
obviously,
bad guys.
The two that I think would be the iconic as far as movies would be Darth Vader and the Wicked Witch of the West or North. Which one was Wicked Witch of the West?
West, maybe. I can't remember, East or
the
West.
The green one.
But the one everybody sees, the bad one in the beginning. Yeah, and who was the first one you said again? Wicked Witch and
Darth Vader.
And Darth Vader, who was a great example because there was good in him, but he was bad, and he had taken some bad choices, but he still was human. And that's the key, why people love it, why Star Wars resonates, why people are still talking about Darth Vader. Billions of people probably around the world are still talking about Darth Vader all these years later, because it was honest in how you can go bad and how you can be good. You can be the bad guy and a good guy, and you can flip between them, because that's what it is to be a busted up, sinning human being mess on this planet. It's the most honest reflection of bad. Which is why it reflects so well. Yeah,
and we love kind of the deathbed confessional too. And Darth Vader sort of had that at the very end. I think there's something to that. What you're saying about kind of when we were growing up, or even before that, more clear-cut good, evil. The Wicked Witch of the West, I don't think you can give that sort of character arc to. She was just all bad all the time.
Yeah.
Darth Vader was more layered, more complex, which is I think why we love that. Also makes me think about when I was a kid, my favorite book in the world was Great Expectations. And the Miss Havisham, who was sort of torments Pip the whole as trying to have Stella spurn him the whole book long. But you also learn of her, being jilted. I believe it was on her wedding day, and you learn of her sorrow that caused her to be bitter and hateful of men, and desirous to hurt them. doesn't excuse that, but you get it. I think that's it right there. When we learn what it is the villain has been through, we can empathize. So if you can have empathy for a villain, I thought the Joker movie was amazing, and that's a villain as sort of that's a hard trick to pull off, villain as your main character, but they did it because you could empathize with the person.
Yeah, and looking at a guy who really actually wanted a better life and to be someone he wanted to be somebody who was decent, but a terrible, busted up, kind of 70-ish New York noirish kind of world, it just breaks your spirit down. But the guy had the potential to be somebody who could have been good and who cared. And he did. There were people in that movie that he cared. There's even the dwarf guy, I think it is, who, when he goes in and kills people in the office, he lets that guy go because he knows that guy, he still has a sense of right and wrong. He knows that guy was on his side and never did anything wrong to him. So yeah, it's the humanity in darkness that it was what grounds. It's why we know as believers that we're messed up and that we do bad and that we're sinners and that at the core of us we'd rather do wrong than right, and it's a battle. And at least with villains, we have a tendency of seeing a struggle in the best ones. And with Darth Vader, you see our own struggle, our own walk, which is doing bad. Quite often we would turn to whatever we could do to have the most power. But in the end, when the realization and the revelation comes that this is not the way and there's something greater and you turned from it, maybe you didn't even have the opportunity to know the truth. And can't say that about Anakin Skywalker, but just you get to an end and you're like, oh, wow, I've made a mistake and I can correct. Like, we love that redemption too. One of the reasons that we love villain stories is redemption is beautiful. A guy who's good is a little screwed up and flawed, but he wins in the end is nowhere near as interesting as the redemption story. We love it. And there's nothing that'll get us weeping, teary-eyed. What's the best redemption story that you can think of? What's one of your favorites? I know I'm putting you on the spot because I don't have an answer for it in the moment.
You are putting me.
So anyway, we'll query our listeners out there. Give us your example of your favorite bad guy who has a conversion in it, not Darth Vader. Yeah, some other stories like that. Love to hear the examples because there are many.
I was thinking about, book-wise, Tale of Two Cities is always great.
Yep. Funny, we both kind of started thinking about that at the same moment.
Yeah, yep. Sacrificing himself. Far, far better place that I go. Yeah. Yeah, great, it's beautiful. Great redemption story there.
Yep, beautiful when somebody sees the light. Because it's it. You see the light, literally.
You know what's weird? I was just thinking about this. All these examples we're using are mostly like superhero stuff and like action, fantasy, and stuff. We haven't mentioned any kind of real person.
Yeah.
Yet.
Can you think of someone?
I think the movie American Beauty sort of set the tone for more flawed characters. I could be wrong about that, but I do remember when that movie came out, the Kevin Spacey character was so kind of despicable. I think, to me, that always sort of symbolized the end of totally virtuous main characters. I don't know if you would call him a protagonist but I think there was a big shift that happened right around that time. I can't remember when that movie came out.
99-ish or something. 01.
Yeah.
Misremembering. 01, something like that. 02. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The time.
Here's a good question. I don't know if the reason that we're less inclined to follow we're getting off topic of villain, by the way, but the question is, I think, relevant. Are we less inclined to like a morally whole, virtuous main character in favor of a more flawed one because one, we see that we are broken ourselves, or is it too because the more definitions of what is moral are kind of shifting all the time. So, well, I don't consider what that person did wrong anymore. I don't know. That's just the thing I was thinking about.
That's interesting though to look back.
I guess you did mention like, well, where do your morals come from?
But at the same time, what we were talking about with Superman changing from someone who's completely boring and doesn't reflect reality to this era now where Superman is much more honest and the way he's depicted as being more human, that's a reflection of society accepting truth, that of brokenness in human beings, where we don't hold up these fictional characters to such high regard. But at the same time, it's when you make evil guys heroes or sort of heroes, that's when it becomes troubling. That's what The Boys is about. I don't know if you've seen The Boys, but it's an Amazon superhero show. It's very well done. It's super hard, R-rated, and I don't recommend it for most people.
Yeah, what were your questions? I was also thinking like, how do you create a great villain? We've sort of touched on that, but what other questions do you have on your list?
That question. Well, okay, so what I was going to ask, I have some questions here, which are more of a statement. What's interesting that we like, if we're careful, is as artists with heroes and villains in particular, are we can use villains to show. Now, I'm saying polarized quite often is not good, but you can use heroes and villains to show what absolute wrong is and absolute right. And it's interesting that we've already spoken that we kind of rebel a bit against the old Superman because he's so good and the villains are bad. And I'm not talking about Lex Luthor, even in the 70s, Gene Hackman, who's kind of a likable. It's hard to not like Gene Hackman as Lex Luthor, for instance. But you have some stories where you have really bad, evil, bad guys who are coming. You can look at a Transformers movie. You have the Transformers are good, doing nothing bad, and you have the evil, Optimus Prime and his guys are good, and what are the evil characters in those movies? The bad guys, the bad aliens are super evil. There's very little room between. And the reason that in a modern 21st century audience we like it is because the technology is so good and the explosions and the spectacle. But honestly, on paper, a lot of these stories are bland and boring because you look at it, you're like, so what? Everybody's good and bad. But what's interesting, if done right, is you can show absolute good and absolute evil. And we live in an era where there are people who don't believe that there's any such thing as absolute good. So what I'm wondering here is this absolute evil and good. And is there something about why we're kind of a bit perturbed about Superman being absolute good, because we don't live in an era where we want to see absolute good and absolute evil. We're rebelling against the natural order of things. I don't know. There was definitely a pushback when Zack Snyder did the first Superman movie. People are like, what? There's some darkness in here. And when he started taking over the DC universe, a lot of people were upset at first. Now everybody's totally cool. But some years ago when it first happened, people were like, what? Batman's dropping F-bombs and he's using machine guns? You're seeing this stuff. And I just wonder, there is something that is good about absolute evil. And even in my wife and I finally got my wife to watch Rise of Skywalker. It's almost a year old now, and she finally got a chance to see it. And the Emperor is evil, pure evil. There's nothing good in him, nothing, pure evil. And you look at that and say, but okay, that works. In a modern time, you can have Rey, who's a Skywalker, or Rise of Skywalker. You're not sure if she's Skywalker or not, but there's Rey, who's a Jedi, and there's the regenerated version of the Emperor, and he's pure evil, and we still eat it up. We're okay with it. So that proves that this modern gray area that we're moving into, where there is no absolute good and absolute evil, that it's not true that as an audience that we won't resonate. It doesn't resonate with us. That you can't have a character that does not know that they are pure good, as far as being in the light, and pure dark. So, but we don't see a lot of that now. We've moved into this weird, distasteful place where a lot of stories about good and evil are all blended together with darkness. Both sides are tainted, which is human. But what does that say? What do you think about that? this absolute good. What are your thoughts on it?
It reminds me of, there was this, he passed away recently, but he was a Christian apologist named Ravi Zacharias. And there was one of my favorite talks he gave. One of the man in the audience kind of stood up and asked a question and challenging the idea of moral absolutes or objective morality. Truth was relative kind of thing. And Ravi Zacharias, one sentence, he said, "Let me ask you one question. Do you lock your doors at night?" Silence. End of discussion right there, because we know you declare that there are no moral absolutes until someone breaks into your house and tries to rob you. Then you believe in them. So I think you make a really good point. And I think even for me, let's take the Superman again. It's not that I want Superman to choose something that is amoral. I want to see a moral struggle where it's a hard choice to make. And I think that's it right there for me. We still believe in that truth, that there is good and there is evil. But we know what it's like to struggle to make that choice. When we struggle in our daily lives, I know this is the right thing to do, but everything in me is like wanting to do the other thing. So I think that was more of, for me, it's more, I want the struggle.
Yeah, I think it's more honest. It's more honest that we are much less likely to be the valiant heroes in our own lives than we are to be the gray, shades of gray in all this. But if we're not careful, certainly as writers, as artists, we can get lost in that, because once you go into that murky, gray, foggy, cloudy place, you can come out disillusioned. You can misrepresent truth the way things really are. You can misrepresent the way God wants things if we're not careful with how we're telling stories. But we need to be honest, really, really honest as well with how we deal with it. It's tough. And things have changed. I think tastes have been changing in the 21st century. We're 20 years in right now. And people definitely want to see reflected in even the good, the best of the good. They want to see reflected sin, even though they wouldn't say, I want to see sin. They wouldn't acknowledge that there's sin. But they would, I think audiences would say, we want to see honesty, they would call it. And I think as believers, that's good for us as artists to say, okay, we do need to be aware, because as I was saying again, what's really interesting is you can have absolute good and evil and do it well if dark is truly shown for what it is and it's honest. And if light is shown for what it truly is, but it shows the honest struggle, you can have absolutes. You can have these and it's okay. But if you sugarcoat things and you're not careful, it's even harder, I think, as a Christian, as a believer, when you're writing these absolute truths of good and evil, right and wrong. It is very easy to be judgmental and to take shortcuts and say, look, this is how it is. It's obvious. And the fact of the matter is, it's not obvious to most people. It's not obvious even to us at times what right and wrong is. And it's not obvious how you get to those choices and how you make them. It's not just, I know the right thing and I just have to do it. I'm going to do a little prayer and then the answer will come to me. Or the fact is, I think we have it harder as believers dealing with these things because we know we can't say there's no such thing as absolute truths, right and wrong, but we also have to be able to actually do this work well and grab people's attention and really succeed. We have to know with the skill that it takes to show these things in an honest way. And it is not easy. It's not easy to do this. It's very easy to screw it up and just say, oh, evil's evil, and just have bad guys, and good is, if I'm good, it's going to work out. And that's where most of us as believers go wrong. That's where we come off the hinge in our writing, in our entertainment, in our lyrics of our songs, in whatever we're doing, our graphic novels, whatever we're doing. we don't understand that, and it takes a lot of work to be able to do this and do it well, and to get out, to break free of the middling in these stories and storytelling. And I don't know, I think you and I know for sure, I'm still working on it. I'm still constantly asking, how can I do this? And I think the other thing that I do fear is coming out with a wrong conclusion in a story that can lead someone astray. I think when we're dealing with heroes and villains, if we're not careful with how we present humanized villains, people might come out saying, yeah, at the end of it, that villain's not really all that wrong or that bad. And I can actually be like that guy, and I can have remorse, but I can do it. And that's another thing that we have to be careful, that we're not we're so humanizing bad, which is good, but we have to know how to, with skill and aplomb, show that the consequences in true darkness when it's not Darth Vader. And that's hard to do. And I'm constantly struggling with how to do that. Does any of that strike you?
Yeah, I think that the one other struggle that you can add in there is we still have a responsibility to point people to hope. And so I keep thinking about the movie and the book, No Country for Old Men. You've got this pure evil serial killer. And then you've also got a deeply flawed, I don't know if the Llewellyn character would be the main. Tommy Lee Jones, the sheriff, would probably be the main character. But great movie, great book, but a very bleak worldview. And you could say that's an honest worldview. At the same time, I do believe we are called to point a mirror at darkness and wrong and evil. At the same time, also shine a light on some, point to a hope. And then that hope we have is that God is going to come and judge evil, and that he is going to restore things and make everything new. And that is a blessed hope right there. So if we had I 1,000th of Cormac McCarthy's talent to actually write No Country for Old Men, I think that as a Christian, I would have to infuse it with some hope. And I'm not, because a bleak outlook is perhaps true, and we can look at events and say, wow, this is a bad ending waiting to happen, but we can't fall prey to that. We have to give the ultimate hope, which is someday, hopefully sooner rather than later, ultimate good is going to win, and evil will be judged, and evildoers will be judged. There's a character in the Bible named Joseph, and Joseph is in the Old Testament. The Old Testament, for those who may not, it is a pure mirror to human sinfulness and brokenness and evil. It is a completely honest book of people and their lives, their screw-ups, their folly. But there's this one guy named Joseph whose brothers sell him into slavery. He goes and sold into Egypt as a slave, but becomes like Pharaoh's right hand man. And Joseph throughout continually honors God. And I remember I heard a preacher one time, he was preaching on the book of Genesis, which is the book of the Bible where Joseph is in, or is written about. And he goes, basically, we always think there are good guys with the white hats and bad guys with the black hats, but we're all the bad guy. We've all got black hats. Jesus has the white hat, but then he kind of threw in, except for Joseph, he's kind of got a gray hat. I love that because, if we can see ourselves as, I think there's something to that. We know that we were created in the image of God, but we were also born with a sinful nature. Romans 3:10, there is no one good, no, not one. There is no one righteous. I don't have to deny that when I know that Christ died for my sins. I believe in him and my sins are forgiven. So I can say, I can embrace a villain. I can embrace a flawed other character. And I don't have to deny that, oh yeah, I can relate to that person because I struggle with the same things. I lie, I cheat, I curse. And I don't have to deny that because I'm freed by the grace that has been given me. So I think there's this amazing freedom that comes when you can say, I am just as messed up as that person was. Whereas, if my worldview is saying I have to earn my keep by being a good person, then I'm going to be continually just in a state of moral confusion because, well, I did go and feed the homeless person right there, but then I also lied to my spouse, so does that even out? And it's this very schizophrenic, very, very hard place to be. And I know that place because that was me, before I knew the Lord. So I think it's a wonderful, it's so freeing when you can know that. And I'm there, cliche, it may sound like a cliche, but for the grace of God go I, when I see the Joker or where I see, a supervillain on screen. I would have gone down that road as well. I went down some dark roads, And
I think as we're talking, we both are big fans of the movie version of No Country for Old Men. I haven't read the book version yet, but it's on my bookshelf. I am going to read it. But what I love about that is you'd say, there's no way I could ever become like this bad guy who goes around with whatever that crazy air pressure thing that Javier Bardem's character has, the killer, the hitman. That would never be me. But the honest truth is you look through the film and you see guy gets greedy, Josh Brolin's character, and he's going after money. He should have just walked away, and it winds up getting him killed. And you see the hitman who just basically flips a coin. He's gotten to a point where he's so callous with life. But that movie, what's really interesting from a perspective, since we're talking about writing as believers and villains, a lot of people that I know, Christians, hate the No Country for Old Men movie. They say it's nihilistic. I very rarely hear people who are believers who say they like that film. And when it came out, not many people that I knew said they liked it, but I loved it. And the thing about Javier Bardem's character is he gets to walk away, but he doesn't get to walk away scot-free. He gets wrecked up right after he gives two kids, they argue over who's going to give him the shirt off their back because he needs clothes. He puts one of the kids' clothing on, and then they argue over the money he gave him, a $100 bill or whatever. But then he gets in that car, and he's driving off scot-free, and he gets in a massive car wreck, and his arm gets shattered. And he has to eke his way out of the car and walk off with a shattered arm. And I just saw that, and I said, that is my depiction of what God in the universe looks like. It is not hammering you over the head that the bad guy goes to prison or he gets shot in a shootout. It's cosmically something bad is going to happen to this guy because of his evil. And he may live to be an old man, but he has invited evil. And whether the Coen brothers acknowledge it or not, there's something in their very spirit that said this guy can't walk away from this story without being seriously punished for what he's done. And he does. He doesn't. And if you think that that's just, well, it's a happy upbeat story. It's not happy upbeat. It's really down and a depressor because he doesn't get busted. He doesn't get killed in the car wreck. But I'm like, that's how life works right there. There was judgment on him. He got punishment because even the Coen brothers knew that guy can't walk off scot-free, but he's not going to die. And as a believer, as a Christian looking at it, I love this. You look at villains and we see the truth in our own walk. And I look at what would take me to become like him. forget that he got punishment at the end. He got some kind of punishment, even though it seems pretty minor. And there's another movie I like that's called Jindabyne. That's an Australian film that has Laura Linney and Gabriel Byrne in it. And it's about a guy who's driving around. You never see the guy, I don't think clearly, but he's a killer. And they set it in Australia, but it's a Raymond Carver story. And the guy in the end, he gets away with killing this girl, and he's sitting at the side of the road, and he's waiting for the next woman to drive down the road in the middle of nowhere in Australia, and he's going to do it again. And out of nowhere, a bee buzzes in his truck, and he swats it away, and it stings him. And then the movie's over. And that's the same kind of ending as No Country for Old Men, which is the natural order of things are telling you that something isn't right. And even filmmakers who don't believe in God can't help but get away with doing something that shows the natural order of things. And if it requires a random bad luck or a bee or whatever, it's, you see that. And that's why for me with villains, I even as a storyteller or as a viewer, why I love watching villains when they're done well, because even the filmmakers can't help but reveal truths about God in, and what did I say? I think I said something recently about, and when we were talking about bad guys, whenever somebody says that, there's no God or whatever, oh yeah, he's going to be around. You're going to see him. Whether the people who are telling the story believe it or not, he's going to show up. Unless it's a story that's complete nonsense and no one will ever see the story, read it, hear it, because it doesn't reflect reality. And that's another thing that's interesting. What we're talking about here is it doesn't matter who tells these stories. If they're done well, which we as believers really have to strive hard for, but if they're done well, they're going to tell a truth about God, even if you don't believe in him. If you know how this universe works, it's going to tell truths about him, and it's going to tell truths about your own moral outrage that's actually God instilling in you right and wrong. So, yeah, I'm glad that you brought up, No Country, because as believers, we got to find out how to do this and not be middling in our work. We have to rely on these truths, but we don't have to hammer people with good guys all the time.
That's a great. It's a great. If there is moral law, there has to be a moral lawgiver.
And that gets to absolutes. We do know that there are absolutes, like you said earlier. There's
whether
definitely,
we believe in that lawgiver or not. If we believe in a moral law, then there's got to be that lawgiver. So if you in your film are, your villain gets the comeuppance at the end, and that is justice or righteousness, that's because there was a moral lawgiver. I was thinking about, remember the movie, I think it was like in the 90s, it was called A Simple Plan. With Billy Bob Thornton and Bridget Fonda and one of the Bills or Jeffs. I can't remember which one. I get all those guys mixed up. But they find the money, some money that's been hidden, and the money depraves them, and they end up committing all sorts of crime and treacheries. And there's a line in there where Billy Bob Thornton goes, "I feel evil." And that was it right there, that one line. Like, I feel evil. And that was coming from the hero protagonist turned villain. I feel evil. That's a great, man. There's a profound truth to that.
And as a matter of fact, I haven't seen that movie since the 90s. But when you just said that line, it's like I remember that. I mean, I remember his realization of the darkness. And there's another line, something else that's equivalent to that. I think there's some other line later in the film that's like it. And it's just like, yeah, exactly. You're getting it. And we as believers, I think, need to not be afraid to go to places and show villains who come to the realization they may not acknowledge God, but they come to the realization what they're doing is wrong. And that's valid for your art. If you're prayerful about how you're doing it and you're not just wallowing in darkness and evil, that's a very valid way of showing what the alternative choice to God is, which is that. If you're going to be in control of everything, it can lead to Javier Bardem's character. I forgot his name, and he may be a man with no name. I can't remember, but his character in No Country for Old Men. That's the natural. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, and that's the natural progression. And I think we one of the biggest things that we get from all this discussion too is, as believers, what are we doing? If we're going to take the moral route and do what God calls us to do, we already see what the warning is if you don't, what you just said about a simple plan. But if you do, we can use these characters and the fact that we're drawn to see bad versus good and these struggles is preparing us for what's our struggle, preparing us for what's right, preparing us for the struggle that we have in this life, and mentally being prepared in advance. And I did a podcast recently with a friend of ours, Brian Godawa, who's an author, and we did a whole podcast on zombies during the pandemic. And he mentioned that what he loved about zombie films were when you take a situation of evil and bad, and he said even it's not just zombie movies, it's movies about evil, demons, whatever. You put people into a place where they can see evil for what it is, and it helps prepare mentally for what your struggle might be in real life. Like, we use stories as a proxy to prepare us for our struggles. And when I was preparing for this podcast, I looked at a couple things, and something came up about preparedness that just, it's the Peter 5:8, where it's talking about you don't know when the end is coming, and stand strong, and the world is going to be going through suffering, and you don't know when the enemy's coming and he's prowling around, and you've got to be on the lookout. And that's it. Like, there's something about looking at these films that we can look and say, how would I deal with myself in this position? And what would my outcome be? And I think what we've talked about tonight was really kind of digging in why we like these films, why they resonate, and also how we process, so that when we're faced with bad things, we look and we say, oh, I have some preparation for these moral quandaries. That's what we do with stories, no matter how the stories are done, through a song or whatever. It's very helpful, I hope. We'll see what happens when we actually face the hardships. If our moral high ground or whatever that we've taken while we're watching our movies and reading our books, if we actually can execute that in real life.
Well, I think that's sort of the big takeaway for me tonight, as far as how would you write, or even the last 2 weeks, how would you write a good character? How would you write a good villain? And I'm thinking about, there's a guy named Paul who wrote several books of the New Testament in the Bible, and he wrote in one of the books, he was talking about how we have there's always that tension between, we know that when Christ comes and forgives us our sin, gives us a new heart, but we still have that old flesh that is our body, which is sinful. So Paul wrote, the things I don't want to do, I do, and the things that I want to do, I don't do. Who will rescue me from this body of death? And I think that's it right there. It's for our heroes, for our protagonists, they have to struggle with that right there. What they want to do, they don't want to do. And then for our villains, they have to have the same struggle. What they don't want to do, they want to do. And they're always wrestling with those competing desires, which is the human experience. And we all get that. So I think with that, if you have those forces at play, I want to do this, but I don't want to do this, and I don't want to do this, but I want to do that, then I think we'll have very rich characters, and I think they will be very honest, and people will be able to empathize with them.
Yeah, we won't be middling with mediocrity. Instead, we'll actually be writing and creating stuff that's believable, honest, true, and not afraid to not afraid to look straight on at real, true probing of, our own demons, and even as if you're writing stories about people who believe in God, you've got to have struggles. You've got to have these kind of struggles with good versus evil, and it can't always just be an enemy of bad and you're good and righteous. That makes for not even middling work that makes for lame and forgettable work. There has to be real honesty in there in the struggles on both sides. So I think that's good. Do you have anything else you want to add, or?
No, I think that's wraps it up for me. Yeah.
Okay. So you may notice really quickly the lighting's changed, my shirt's changed. I'm recording this as an addendum a few days after this episode of King of the Middle, because I realized as I was cutting this, there are some things I said that were broad proclamations that weren't true. There was lots of room to argue alternate points of view, and I realized I was saying a lot of broad things about heroes and about Superman. So really quickly, for a few minutes, I wanted to talk about a couple of things said earlier in this podcast that need clarification. So first off, when we talk about Superman, yes, he was a goody guy. It seemed like to us growing up, certainly in things like the Super Friends cartoon and in the TV series that was before Mike and I were born, that aired, but it still aired in reruns all the time. So that version of Superman was kind of boring. But the thing is, there's truth that even with those really good versions of Superman, there's important stuff about that we can learn about how to show true good. Because what we don't want to do, we don't want to say you can't have the simple, really good and really evil, because that's boring in a modern age, in the 21st century. We already talked about Star Wars, that you can have good characters and really evil characters, and they're not wavering that much or at all. And that's okay if it's done well. And a couple of the things that are important to note about how tools that we use as creators and artists, how to do that well, is we have to be able to show the moral dilemma that the good guys face. Superman, when he's dealing with helping people out, what are the consequences of that assistance? And we said that Zack Snyder does that in the newer versions, like when he's in the Man of Steel and Superman's fighting. Michael Shannon's character in that movie plays Zod. That's the kind of moral quandary. A person, a character, a hero who's good, who has to deal with the consequences of I'm fighting and I'm ripping a city up. And that was actually covered in Superman 2, the original, with Zod, Terrence Stamp as Zod back then, Christopher Reeves. That they did it well. The other thing that we have to be aware of is, what are the ties? Would a good character who's going to stay on the straight and narrow, how do we make that compelling? They have to have emotional ties to others who are potentially collateral damage, or there can be a very serious impact on them based on the decisions that the hero makes. And again, we have with Superman, Lois Lane, there's always the tie to, he may be invincible, but she's not. And in Star Wars, let's say most recently the finale in the trio, the new Rise of Skywalker, what you have in there is temptation. So when you deal with the weakness of others who the hero is tied to, who is going to do the right thing, but there's the weakness in that emotional bond, that tie that puts them at risk, the hero. When you have temptation, like you have Rey, are you going to become like the Emperor? And when you have collateral damage, people who are around when you're doing the right thing, but they may get hurt. Those are three ways that you can use those tools. And also showing a flawed character, hero, who can still be good. And I think in the fourth Superman movie, that's pretty much forgotten because it was a B movie, but he starts becoming a drunk. He's dealing with Christopher Reeves again. They got him one last time, and he was dealing with being a superhero, but being distraught. That's another way. Again, it's kind of this temptation, do right or not. So I just wanted to clarify with that we are most definitely not, especially as believers, Michael and I are not saying don't make good old-fashioned films, TV, books, songs, art, graphic novels, whatever. We're not saying don't tell very good and very evil characters. Don't tell stories about good and evil characters. We're not saying you can't make things very polarized at times, but just be aware of how to do it. And we don't want to fall into that trap of saying everything has to be modern, tinged with darkness. And what's interesting, another thing that we said during this conversation was, Michael mentioned American Beauty and how Kevin Spacey's character was kind of this anti-hero, and that ushered in an era, it seemed, around that time, the turn of the century into the 21st century. And what I think to clarify that is, that ushered in a more mainstream era of the anti-hero becoming a hero. And I think a lot of films you can see starting in the early 2Ks, that became much more mainstream, ending up now on all these superheroes, culminating in something like The Boys on Amazon, which is like, there's practically no one, almost none of the heroes are good. There are a couple characters in there who are good, 2 or 3, but they're mostly all very seriously flawed and even have some evil wrapped up in them. And we want to be careful about that. But I do want to say, as a film buff, and I did study in my degrees film, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it, the anti-hero's been around a long time. And leading into the end of the 20th century, you have Danny Boyle on Train Spotting, and then the really good sequel, Train Spotting 2, Ewan McGregor's an anti-hero. But you go back into the 40s, and you have Charles Foster Kane, and in the 70s you have Clockwork Orange, Malcolm McDowell's character, and Michael Corleone in the Godfather movies. And I've even seen lists of the greatest anti-heroes of all time, and one of them comes up a lot at the top, is Travis Bickle, which is Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver. So making films about anti-heroes, they're not new. This isn't a new 21st century thing. But what's interesting is, with the exception of a film like The Godfather, where we kind of have made Michael Corleone and that family into sort of heroes, films prior to the 21st century didn't make it a point frequently to make the anti-hero this hero to be elevated. And we have that much more now. And then finally, there is a great article, a visual essay by a website, a channel on YouTube called Nerd Writer, and they have a deconstruction of myths that explains how this metamorphosis happens when we get used to certain kind of legend, a myth, and storytelling, and a way of telling stories that goes through a progression, an arc of first making fun of it, and then kind of updating it some, but still respecting it, then demythologizing it and completely breaking it down, which is where we are now with shows like The Boys. And then finally you get to this kind of acceptance of the demythology. So we're putting a link at the bottom of wherever you're seeing this podcast, on our webpage or on Facebook, YouTube. We're putting a link down so you can take a look at that, because it's great. And as an artist, it's really great to look at that and to see how to use these techniques. So Michael, back to you to wrap this sucker up.
We will be back next week. We appreciate you listening. And again, I'm Michael. This is Chris, and this has been King of the Middle Podcast. Have a great rest of the week.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. Good night.